Okay, so for section 6.1 part C, this is going to be the key. Now in section 6.1 part C, they wanted you to factor these polynomials using grouping. So you'll notice that all 8 problems, the first 4 and the last 4, there are 4 terms. And so when you have 4 terms, one of the methods you want to try is grouping. And it may or may not always work, but in this section it does. So basically, again, the first thing you have to do is make sure you look for a GCF of each term of each polynomial first. So make sure you look for GCF just like you've done in the previous worksheet. All right. So in this particular case, if you look at all 4 terms, the GCF is 1. So that's GCF. So once you found the GCF, though, if it was something other than 1, you would factor it out. But in this case, it is 1. So then you're going to group the first 2 and the last 2. Now there are times when the first 2 and the last 2 do not work, so you may have to switch some terms around to make it work. But in this worksheet, grouping the first 2 and grouping the last 2 will be enough. Okay, so from the first group, if you cover this part up, and then you kind of look at just the first group, the GCF of the first group is 5m. So I can factor out a 5m from the first group, 5m, and so remember the distributive property, 5m times n. 5m times n is 5m n plus 5, so 5m times 5 is 25m. So that's the first group. And then from the second group, always factor out this middle sign, this middle operation. So that's going to be a plus whatever that GCF is here. So if you look at these two terms, I'm going to factor out a 3n squared. So a 3n squared. And then hopefully what should happen is if you are able to use the first 2 and the last 2, then the factors inside these parentheses from this group and this group should be the same. So 3n squared times n is 3n cubed plus 3n squared times 5 is 15n squared. And notice these are the same. That's what you were hoping for. So you factor out the n plus 5 from these two groups. So you're going to get the answer to be n plus 5 times 5m plus 3n squared. So if I factor out an n plus 5 here, you're left with 5m. If you factor out an n plus 5 here, you're left with 3n squared. And you can always check yourself. If you look at this, n plus 5 times 5m is this, 5m times n plus 5. n plus 5 times this 3n is this. All right, so you're done. Okay, over here, same idea. Look for GCF, though. The GCF here is 1. So we can group the first 2, group the last 2. From the first group, I can factor out a b squared. So that's the GCF of the first group is b squared. And when I factor out the b squared, I get 4b, because b squared times 4b is 4b cubed, plus 1, because b squared times 1 is b squared. You got to have something there. Since these were 2 terms, you have to have 2 terms in here. All right, from the second group, again, remember, always factor out this middle operation. So I'm going to factor out a positive GCF from this group. So from this group here, the GCF is 2, so I'm going to factor out a 2. And again, remember we said, hopefully these 2 factors here from this group and this group will be the same, and then I could factor it out from both groups. So I get 2 times 4b is 8b plus 2 times 1 is 2. So from here, I can factor out a 4b plus 1, and I'm left with b squared plus 2. All right, so that's going to go in these. So there's your answer. So here the answer is n plus 5 times 5m plus 3n squared. Here the answer is 4b plus 1 times b squared plus 2. All right, and over here, again, look for GCF. The GCF here is 1. So I'm going to group the first 2 and the last 2. So if I group the first two, I can factor out from the first two. Looks like I can factor out a 3p squared. So a 3p squared. So from the first group, I can factor out a 3p squared. And so 3p squared times 4p. 3 times 4 is 12. P squared times p is p cubed. When you multiply like bases, you add exponents. 2 plus this 1 is 3. Minus 3p squared times 7 is 21p squared. Over here, remember, always factor out that middle operation. I'm going to factor out a, and then here that's a 7. So the GCF here is 7. So 7 times 4p minus, so 7 times 4p is 28p, and then 7 times 7 is 49. So 7 times a negative 7 is negative 49. And again, notice these two groups, they have a 4p minus 7 in common. So I can factor out the 4p minus 7. So I get 4p minus 7 times 3p squared plus 7. All right, so that's going to go here. So 4p minus 7 times 3p squared plus 7. All right, and over here, the GCF again is 1. So I'm going to factor out from this group here. So you can group the first two and the last two. From this group, I can factor out a 2x squared. A 2x squared. And I get 2x squared times 6x is 12x cubed plus 2x squared times 1 is 2x squared. All right, over here, remember, always factor out the GCF from the second group. Use this middle operation as your sign that you're going to factor out. So I'm going to factor out a negative 5. A negative 5. So negative 5 times 6x is a negative 30x. And always check, because you really want this factor here to be the same as this factor. And then a negative 5 times a positive 1 is a negative 5. All right, so when you distribute the negative 5, you get negative 30x minus 5. And so now notice these two groups, they have a 6x plus 1 in common. So I can factor out a 6x plus 1. And I'm going to be left with, when I factor out a 6x plus 1, I'm left with 2x squared minus 5. All right, so that goes here. So 6x plus 1 times 2x squared minus 5. All right, the next page of this worksheet. All right, now, again, look for GCF. So over here, let's see, there is no x in every term, there's no y in every term, but if you look at the coefficients, 12, 15, 8, and 10, it looks like the GCF here is 1. All right, so GCF is 1. And so from the first group, I'm going to factor out a 3x, it looks like. So it looks like from the first group, the GCF of the first group is 3x. So when you factor out a 3x, you get 3x times 4x squared is 12x cubed plus, and then over here, 3x times 5y is 15xy. So 3 times 5 is 15, x times y is xy. All right, now over here, you got to factor out a negative, always do the middle sign. So it'll be a negative, and that looks like a 2y. 2y. So I can factor out a 2y. All right, now again, hopefully this and this will be the same. If it's not, you'll have to rearrange the terms. And if it still doesn't work, if nothing works, then this is prime. Okay? But in this worksheet, first two group together, and the last two group together should work. Okay, so negative 2y rather, times 4x squared gives me negative 8xy, x squared y. Notice I get the 4x squared so far. And then a negative times a positive is a negative, but negative 2y times a positive 5y. Negative 2 times positive 5 is negative 10. Y times y is y squared. And notice these two are the same, so I can factor out the 4x squared plus 5y. So 4x squared plus 5y times, now if I factor out the 4x squared plus 5y, I get 3x minus, over here, minus 2y. Alright, so that goes here. So 4x squared plus 5y times 3x minus 2y. Okay, over here, let's see. It looks like this time I can factor out a 3, it looks like. I can factor out a 3. So here the GCF is 3. So I'm going to get 3 times, all right, now remember, you have 4 terms here, so you need 4 terms inside. 3 times all of those 4 terms need to be this, the original polynomial. So 3 times 6n squared, n cubed, minus 9n squared, 3 times negative 9 is negative 27, plus 8n, 3 times 8 is 24, and then minus 12. All right, so that's what I have so far. All right, now, again, if you cover up that GCF, now remember, that in your answer, you have to have that GCF, so 3 is going to be in here somewhere. 3 is going to be in here. But if you cover up the 3, and you see you have this polynomial of 4 terms, you want to factor by grouping, so you can group the first 2, group the last 2. Okay? So I get 3, bring it down, bring the GCF down, 3 times, all right, now I'll put that in bracket, and I'm going to group the first 2, the last 2. So from the first group, I can factor out a 3n squared from the first group. And I'm left with 3n squared, so we need to cover that 3, cover the 3. I get 3n squared times 2n is 6n cubed minus 3n squared times 3 is, 3n squared times a negative 3 is a negative 9n squared. Over here I'm going to factor out a positive 2, and hopefully it'll be this right here. 2 times, I'm sorry, you can factor out a 4, excuse me. 4 is a GCF. I always take out the GCF. Because when I said a 2, notice I would have said 2 times 4n, but that's not a 4n, that's a 2n. So to use the GCF from the groups. So GCF is 4 here. So 4 times 2n is 8n, minus 4 times 3 is a 12. And then from, again, just like we did in the other problems, from here, these two groups have a 2n minus 3. So I get 3 times 2n minus 3 times 3n squared plus 4. So if I factor out the 2n minus 3, I'm left with 3n squared. That's what this is. If I factor out the 2n minus 3 here, I'm left with a plus 4. And that's what that is. Okay, so there's your answer there. So you get 3 times 2n minus 3 times 3n squared plus 4. Okay, over here in number 7, it looks like there's an x in every term, so I know I can factor out that part of my GCF will be an x. 6, 12, 10, and 20, so the GCF is a 2x, it looks like. So GCF is 2x. There's not a y in every term, so you can't factor out a y, but I can factor out a 2x. So I get 2x times, let's see, 2x times 3xy gives me 6x squared y. 2 times 3 is 6, x times x is x squared, plus, and then the y, plus 2x times 6x is 12x squared. 2 times 6 is 12, x times x squared, minus 2x times 5y. 2x times 5y gives me negative 5y gives me negative 10xy. 2 times negative 5 is negative 10, x times y is xy. And then minus 2x times a negative 5 gives me a negative 20x. All right, just like we did here with this one, cover up the GCF if you have to, and then notice you have 4 terms. So let's try factoring this polynomial here that's in parentheses by grouping. So from the first group, it looks like I can factor out the GCF here from the first group is 3x. So I get 2x, I'll put that in bracket, and then so that's going to be, again, cover this up if you have to. So that's going to be 3x times, and so 3x times y is 3xy, plus 3x times 2 is 6x. Over here, you factor out the negative, remember. It's always it's always that middle sign. So here I can factor out a negative 5, and I get negative 5 times y. Now always look at this. You hopefully want this to be this. If it doesn't work, switch terms around, and then do it all over again. So negative 5 times y is negative 5y. A negative times a positive is a negative. A negative 5 times a positive 1 is a negative 5. Oops. Oh, I'm sorry. That should be 10 right here. All right, so that's a 10. I made a mistake here. 2 times 10 is 20. Okay? All right, so that should be a 5, right? I mean, a 2, right? So that's a 2. Okay, and then notice these are the same. And so now from these two groups here, this group and this group, I can factor out a y plus 2. So I get y plus 2. So if you factor out a y plus 2 here, you're left with 3x. Factor out a y plus 2 here, you're left with minus 5. But don't forget, you got to have GCF in your answer. So there's your answer right here. There's your answer. Just rewrite it. You get 2x times y plus 2 times 3x minus 5. All right. So this number 7 has 3 factors in its factorization. 2 is a factor, x is a factor, y plus 2 is a factor, and 3x minus 5 is a factor. So it has 4 factors. Here you have 3 factors. 3 is a factor, 2n minus 3 is a factor, 3n squared plus 4 is a factor. So remember, factors are separated by products. So here you read this as 3 times 2n minus 3 times 3n squared plus 4. Over here you say 2 times x times y plus 2 times 3y minus 5. So there's your 4 factors, but there's your answer. All right, and then finally, let's see, the GCF here is, let's see, 5, 10, 6, and 4. All right, so for the coefficients, it looks like the GCF is just 1. For the variables, though, I don't have n's in every term, but I do have m's, and I can just factor out an m. So here the GCF is just m. So you factor out an m, and you're going to get 15m n squared. So m times 15m n squared gives you 15m squared n squared. Minus, then that's going to be 10m n. M times negative 10m n is a negative 10m squared n. Minus, and then here, that's going to be 6n, negative 6n. M times a negative 6n is a negative 6m n. And then plus 4. All right, now, just like previous problems, you're going to group the first two, group the last two. And if you need to cover up that GCF M, do so, but that is going to be part of your answer down here. And it should be part of your answer all the way down. So the next, if you say equal sign here, then you're going to say that has to equal M times this right here. So from this first group, it looks like the GCF from the first group right here, just this right here, for the first two terms, the GCF here is going to be 5mn. There are m's in both terms and there are n's in both terms, but you always use the one with the smallest exponent. So there'll be 5mn times 5mn times 3n gives me 15mn squared. N times n is n squared. 5m times 3 is 15m. Minus 5mn times a 2 is negative 2 rather, is a negative 10mn. So that's that. From here, I'm going to factor out the negative. Remember the middle sign. I always do middle sign. The GCF here is 2. And you're going to get negative 2 times 3n. This is what you wanted. And then a negative times a negative gives me a positive, and so it will be negative 2 times a negative 2 gives me a positive 4. Notice this group and this group have a 3n minus 2 in common. So now you factor out the 3n minus 2. Make sure you bring down the m, though. That's still part of your answer, the GCF. So 3n minus 2. So if I factor out a 3m minus 2 from this group right here, the first group, I'm left with 5mn minus, and then over here, that's 2. All right, so there's your answer. So my answer has 3 factors, m. The other factor is 3n minus 2, and the other factor is 5mn minus 2. Okay? All right, so that's going to take care of that worksheet. So this is worksheet 6.1, Part C.